So this is the work that I've been doing on intercropping. So this particular trial, this is now I think it's its 4th year where I've been doing what I've called sort of that low medium rainfall intercropping. So the concept of intercropping is to grow 2 species on 1 piece of land with the aim generally to improve productivity. So to get a productivity gain by growing 2 crops together. There's lots of secondary benefits as well, so that we all know the benefits of break crops, but also it's a risk management strategy. Reduced input costs, because obviously we've got a pulse here with an oil seed, and environmental and soil health is the other aspect of why people tend to go for intercrops. So I guess we don't see a lot of these systems in Australia. They're not commonly seen in Australia, but they're a system that's been around for donkey's years. Most subsistence farming systems are based on something loosely like intercropping, but we're starting to see a bit more appetite and uptake for these dual purpose systems. A little bit in Australia, we're seeing uptake in Canada. When I was over there 2 years ago, I think there was something like 10,000 acres of commercial intercropping being done in the bottom part of the Saskatchewan province. So that was just one province, one region where they were getting that level of uptake of dual purpose cropping. A lot of those systems were based on pulse and oil seed. So they've got quite a big flax industry over there, like linseed. So a lot of their systems were around that chickpea, so the oil seed pulse mix. And then there's a bit of uptake starting to happen in Europe as well. So what's sort of happening in Australia is we tend to see there are farmers dabbling in these systems. Most of the growers I know who are mucking around with this stuff do tend to be in that lower to medium rainfall zone. And the majority of what they're doing is oilseed, so canola and pulse. Not a lot of them are playing with cereals and oil seeds or cereals and pulses, and there's probably a reason, like a decent reason why. So there was recently a review done of intercropping and companion cropping, and I can go into the difference between the 2 of them if anyone wants to know. But there was a recent review looking at what research was being done or has been done, and also what growers are doing. So in terms of the research, there's not a massive body of research in Australian systems on this. The wheat combinations, where there's been research on wheat and say a pulse, the average, and because I'm on camera I now have to look up the exact number. So the average increase across those trial sites, so this is a yield increase, was 12%. So that's with a wheat legume mix. But where they've then looked at the studies on oil seeds and pulses, it's sitting at an average about 49% yield increase. So one of the reasons why that wheat system is one that I personally haven't done a lot of research into is, I guess one of the reasons why we grow a break crop is to avoid having a cereal in that particular year. And also our cereals are very water use efficient. So you know, in the low medium rainfall zones, water is one of your biggest tools in your system. So by combining a pulse, which generally has a lower water use efficiency, with another crop that has a slightly higher water use efficiency, the aim is to exploit that a little bit more. So I guess it's very promising, these oilseed pulses mixes, and that's why we've gone down that track. And also I'm a pulse researcher, so I'm going to stick with this system, but we also know that this system is the one that we're seeing the biggest productivity gains on. In terms of my research on this particular suite of stuff, it has all been done in those lower to medium rainfall zones, and where they've been successful, we see it at sitting about that 30 to up to about 80% productivity gain. And the intercrops that we've seen achieve that has been the vetch and canola and the lentil and canola. We've really struggled a bit to get the pea and canola to over yield well. So I suppose intercropping really, a lot of it in South Australia probably started with what's dubbed as that peola mix. In my trials it hasn't performed as well as that lentil canola, vetch canola mix. So I guess to date they're the two most promising mixes we've seen. You'll see there's some pretty funky looking canola sitting up there, which is obviously not canola. That's mustard. That came out of actually a discussion with this group here last year. We didn't have very good canola establishment in the site, or as well as we would have liked last year. Obviously we didn't have that same problem. We had really good conditions for sowing this year. So this was actually sown on the 27th of April, so it was quite early. We had really good soil moisture at that stage, so we went in with it, and you can see just how well the canola responds to those good soil moisture conditions and good sowing conditions. So we did have very good canola establishment at this site. What we're seeing at some of our other sites where we've got intercrops in, the canola hasn't established as well. Canola really likes those good soil moisture conditions to go into, and so we do struggle a little bit sometimes with our canola. So we thought we'd have a crack at mustard. Mustard is a little bit more robust. It doesn't mind the it doesn't seem to be as susceptible to those limitations that canola does. It is still like a smaller seed, but we thought we'd give it a go, and you can certainly pick the mustard out. It's anything that looks scraggly sitting above the canopy, and when we go down and have a look, you'll see that it's much further ahead in terms of its pods as well, and it's filling its pods. So that's the reason why we thought we'd have a look at mustard, particularly as we go into our lower environments. It may be a better fit for our intercropping systems. The other thing you'll notice here, we do have some different ones from what we had last year. So here we've got lentil and faba bean, and you won't probably be able to pick where the vetch and faba bean plots are because the vetch has grown over top of the faba beans. So about 2 weeks ago, the canopy was sitting at the same height, the vetch and the beans, and the vetch had been trellising up the beans. Now the vetch has left the beans behind and is sitting above the canopy of the beans, so you really got to look in there to find the beans.
Is that any grower research to find out how much of a gross margin per hectare above growing the standard crops people need to get excited about storing and cleaning?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I've done the gross margins on some of the trials, so where we're using actual input costs and then attributed a seeding cost, grain cleaning cost. And even with the grain cleaning costs, they were coming out ahead in terms of gross margin. But what you're discussing is another element on top of that, which is that nuisance value. So
Whether people put $50, $100, $300 a hectare on it,
So yeah, the discussion and the question for those now listening online is attributing the cost or the value of the storage and the cleaning of the grain, because obviously when you harvest these plots, we're harvesting them together. So it comes in as a mixed grain sample. You then have to clean it. But that also brings in the logistics of storage. So you've then got to store and separate out 2 lots of grain. So I don't have a good feel on what a grower would put a value on that. I can attribute a value for cleaning it. I think off the top of my head it's about $50 a tonne. Is that right? Well, hopefully only once. That's why we've got our weed experts, so we don't have weeds in these systems. So you only have to clean them once. A lot of the growers that I've spoken to who are doing this system, they're actually cleaning on farm themselves, just throwing things back through the header or allowing the wind to do some of the work with the canola component. But yeah, one of the issues is going to be you've then got two lots of grain to store. You've got downtime during harvest, so there's a labour cost if you clean immediately. And there is probably a limited storage time where you can store 2 separate types of grain together before you clean it. So you're right in that there is a cost there, and it would differ from farm to farm depending on logistics of that particular farm. So I'd be keen to actually get, I've got a few growers who have been in contact with me that hopefully I'll get a chance to sit down with, and we can sort of discuss a few more of the logistics, because what I'm finding is one farmer will actually have a solution to one problem. So one of the growers I was talking to, he has no problems with being able to harvest and clean his grain samples. His biggest challenge is which combination is going to work best for him. Whereas other growers I talk to, it is that harvest logistics and seed cleaning that is a barrier to entry or a headache for them. So I think those mechanical issues are one thing that does limit adoption of these systems. And what I've noticed is that the problem varies from grower to grower as which one is the biggest headache or the biggest barrier to coming into these systems. So yeah, if anyone's sort of keen on dabbling in this space or has given it a crack and wants to continue those discussions, I'd actually really love to get a group of the growers together who are playing or are keen in this space to have a roundtable discussion on that, because that's one of the barriers. But like I said, some growers don't identify that harvest as an issue at all, and others do. So I think there's a lot to be learnt from the growers who are using these systems. But very good question, and I'll try and get some more figures around it for you. Sorry?
Can't be bothered.
Sorry?
There's a figure there somewhere that would get people excited. I'm not sure where it is.
Yeah, I think
You're easily excited, Kurt.
historically the barriers to adoption of these systems has been things like weed control. The increase in the amount of herbicide tolerant crop options overcomes a lot of that. That if you do need an in-crop weed control option and you want to put in an intercrop, you do have the ability to pair a lot of the pulses with oilseed and have that in-crop weed control option. The other thing I would say is if you've got a really weedy paddock and you know you've got a weed issue there, this isn't the system to put in that paddock. The upside is you do get, in some of these systems, you'll get ground cover a lot earlier in the season. So this year we were able to take photos and use a data package to look at ground cover in a much better way, because obviously I like intercrops. If I come out here and do a visual assessment, of course my intercrops are going to look great because I like them. So what we wanted to do was take out that bias. So we used a software program where we could look at ground cover, and a lot of the intercrops were achieving ground cover a lot earlier than the sole crops on their own. So I guess from a weed control option, they do smother, and you can see for some of these, particularly where you've got things like vetch in there, smothering ability is fantastic in that system. So you do have one of the benefits of intercropping is by having more and a diversity of plants in there, you do end up with that ground cover tends to be a little bit earlier, and you've got increased competition. So you've got increased competition between the crop, but any weed that's in there as well, you've also got that competition with. So I think the barrier, the excuse that weeds are a problem for these systems is probably not there anymore, but I would definitely not recommend putting them in a weedy paddock. You're just asking for trouble. If you've got a weed problem in a paddock, you should be looking to control that with our more conventional solutions before you start moving into a complex system like this. So this is the sort of system you move into when you've got everything else ticking along right. So I guess that's weed control. The other two barriers that I see to adoption, historical adoption to intercropping, is technology in terms of how do you sow them. I think now most of you have equipment that can be easily adapted to these systems. How we do it is we've got the luxury of having 2 cones on our plot seeder, just like you guys have 2 bins in your air seeder, and we're able to put one seed down one cone and the other seed down the other cone. When I first started playing in these systems, I was really lucky to have, and half of you in the audience are probably too young to remember shearer combines, but I was lucky enough, there's a few giggles there, so some of you obviously had one at some point. I was lucky enough to have access to a shearer combine where I had a small seed box. I was able to drop the canola or the small seed directly in front of the press wheel out of the small seed box. I had the grain coming out of my main grain box, and I was still able to put fertiliser out through my fertiliser box. So just thinking about your equipment and how you can adapt it, most of them can be adapted to these sort of systems. You'll also see that, I think further down, we've got different row configurations in the intercrops. So we've got what we call mixed rows, where the seed is going in the same row, and then we've got what we call our single skip row arrangements, which is where we have one row of the canola, the second row is the pulse, and then we go back canola, pulse, canola, pulse. Those 2 systems are the ones that are most easily adapted to your seeders. From a research perspective, we then have what's called our double skip row arrangements, and you'll see probably this one here, where you've got 2 rows of the canola, then 2 rows of peas, 2 rows of canola. Now in terms of yield benefit, we tend to get slightly better yields from that system than we do from the single skip and the mixed. So I guess that we know that we can overcome some of those seeding logistics with the modern seeders that you have now. It does mean that you're pulling tubes off, blocking tubes, so there's that little bit of downtime in doing that. And then the other one is harvest. So harvesting them is not so much the problem. We've been able to successfully harvest with our plot headers, which are the same as your headers, all of these intercrop combinations. We obviously haven't done, this is the first year we've done bean and lentil, but we don't think we're going to have any problems with that. I will say the one that we have had problems with, and we've got trials at Hart Field Day site, is where we've got chickpea and linseed. That's a nightmare, and I've got to be really careful now what I say and that I don't say any expletives because it's being recorded. Flax or linseed is something that I've never played around with before. I didn't know anything about, but turns out whilst you can get the pod and easily squeeze it between your fingers and it falls apart, that's not what it does when it goes through a header. So I don't know if anyone's had to play around with it, but you basically, to harvest it, you're on maximum wind speed, maximum thrashing. Chickpeas didn't really like that. So what ended up happening is where we had them in combination, we ended up with a beautiful clean sample of linseed and something that resembled going into hummus production in our chickpeas. So it absolutely cracked it to smithereens. We think we've got ways around that, and some of them are we harvest when the chickpeas aren't that ripe. So they were obviously very mature at that point in time and they cracked really easily. So coming a little bit earlier with our harvest timing, and harvesting when it's cool. So again, the seed's not as brittle. The other option is that we can actually go over it twice. So we can harvest they sit far enough apart in terms of their canopy, we can harvest them twice, increase cost. It then made me think, why are they getting away with this system in Canada? Why can't we easily harvest that system over here? And it's because I think it's because they're harvesting when they're at about 18% moisture in the chickpeas. So the chickpeas are probably bouncing around through there quite happily. So that is the only one where we really have struggled to harvest it well. These mixes, we have had no problems. We get a really lovely sample off of them, and then we obviously can clean out the two afterwards. So harvestability of what is in front of you hasn't caused us any problems. It's then the logistics of cleaning those two grains out. They are vastly different seed sizes, so some growers do have they've developed systems where they can easily clean it on farm themselves, and others get a seed cleaner in to do it. In terms of separating out the seed size, it's not a problem in any of these mixes. It's just you've got to do it. So I guess they've been the logistical barriers to production. All of them can be overcome. So I think those historical reasons as to why these systems didn't work is probably not there anymore. I think the other thing we lack is good quality information about these systems. I think that's probably one of our challenges is there isn't a lot of good quality research data to say which systems work best. We're obviously working on that and we've got some of that data, but some of those secondary benefits we're just starting to try and measure and record. So things like ground cover, particularly in some of our environments where we have really vulnerable soils, where pulses historically, one of the barriers there is, and one of the challenges they're facing with is the pulses leaving the soil much more exposed. This soil's lovely soil, so that's not so much of an issue here, but that's a consideration for some of those environments, and where we're seeing a lot of the vetch and canola mixes, just trying to get that increased ground cover and a bit of anchorage from the canola, so that over the summer, as those the vetch and the lentils and that who break down quite quickly, you've still got a little something there in the canola to help hold the system together. And then the other one is around nitrogen input into the system. So we're starting to measure that. Last year's intercropping trial, Brendan kindly oversowed for us, and we'll go and sample out of that. No, it was perfect. Saved us a job. So that's all been oversown with weed, isn't it? Or yeah. So what we'll do is we'll actually come back in and make a mess going in, of course, and cut out those plots and look at what yield benefit we got from the wheat over top of all these different combinations here. So we'll have the yield benefit of the wheat over the canola, the sol canola, the sol vetch, and also the intercrop mixes. So we're starting to gather some of those that data around the rotational benefit of the intercrop in that system, and some of the work where we've measured soil nitrogen is at the end of the season, the soil nitrogen was slightly lower in the intercrop mix compared to your straight pulse, which is what you would expect. There's a bit of canola in there sucking things up, but still significantly higher than the canola, which will have had fertiliser on it. So from the initial data set, we think that the systems are still putting nitrogen back into the system and also feeding the canola. So I guess we're looking at from there how much cost saving you've got in terms of not having to put upfront nitrogen, but also what nitrogen's it leaving for the subsequent crop. So there's some of the things we're just starting to sort of play around with a bit.